Hi there! Welcome to Boy Meets Quilt. I'm Andrew V. Hansen, and this is the second in my virtual trunk show series that I've decided to do. In my first video, I showed you the first quilt I ever made, and I thought that was going to be the last quilt I would ever make too, because it was a lot of work. But sure enough, maybe just 2 weeks later, I started getting the itch. And I'm sure many of you have had the same experience when it comes to quilting. You just get hooked. And I was hooked. And so I decided if I'm going to continue quilting, I needed to learn some basics. And thankfully, on Craftsy, which became Blueprint and now is something we'll see sometime in the future. But at the time it was Craftsy. I was able to find another Amy Gibson tutorial, whom I really loved from the first quilt that I made. And so she did a Craftsy Block of the Month series, and it was free. So all of those things combined made it the perfect project for me. And when I looked through the project, I realized that I would be learning so many basic quilting blocks and techniques, and I just thought, how perfect would this be? By the time I complete this quilt, I will have made so many different traditional blocks or variations on traditional blocks. So I was very excited to try it. And so once I had pieced all of my blocks together, I decided this would be a great opportunity to learn how to free motion quilt. I figured since I was learning piecing and sewing techniques for the actual blocks, I would go ahead and learn some free motion quilting technique. Mostly because I really hated using my walking foot to do the quilting in my first quilt. And so I wanted to see if the free motion quilting would be something that I find actually easier, which turns out I do think it's a lot easier. I actually really love free motion quilting. I'm so glad I did this. So it happens that this particular quilt is used in a Leah Day Craftsy tutorial. Leah Day quilts a sampler, free motion quilts a sampler, something like that. I'll show the screenshot. And she goes through the quilt and she gives you different techniques and different ways to free motion a quilt, specifically this quilt. Now, I didn't end up using any of her actual motifs, but what I loved about the tutorial is she teaches, as an alternate, she teaches the quilt as you go technique. And I thought that would be a really great way for me to learn how to free motion quilt so that I could just take each individual square and get it ready to quilt with all the pin basting and everything, and then quilt each individual square rather than trying to quilt an entire quilt when I'm just learning this technique. And I think that was the smartest thing I could have done. I think I would not have loved free motion quilting if I were trying to manipulate a whole quilt when I didn't know what I was doing. And that way it also gave me time to really think about each individual block and different styles and motifs and techniques that I wanted to try out from watching people like Angela Walters and Leah Day on their tutorials that they have about free motion quilting. And so I'm really glad I did that. And I think if anyone is trying to learn how to free motion quilt, my main suggestion is to start small. Start with a pillow, start with a single block, just start small and just get some practice under your belt before you attempt a full quilt. And then once you get the techniques fairly mastered, the full quilt will still be a lot of work, but I still think it's a lot easier than using a walking foot because you can just kind of focus on one area at a time and then manipulate the quilt, focus on one area at a time, and you don't necessarily have to always keep moving the quilt all the time, every time you want to change direction like you do with a walking foot. So let's take a look at the blocks individually. All right, so the first block that I made for this quilt is this Asterisk block. And this was a very simple block to make, and I just learned some super basic quilting cutting techniques for this block. Cutting and piecing. And it went really fast. And if we take a closer look at this block, you'll see this was only the second block that I quilted with my new free motion quilting techniques that I was learning. And so this middle star, it's not all that great, but it's not bad. But you can see I've got some thread nests coming up through the back. And so I was still learning my machine, learning the techniques, and I was keeping the design relatively simple throughout the block. But that's how we learn. You can't really see, but I did wavy lines in these orange blocks here. And then each month, we actually made 2 blocks. And so they used similar techniques, but had created separate blocks. And so the Asterisk block was the first one. And then this Wonky Pound Sign block was the second one for the month of January. And this required a little bit more, it's a little more improv-y, but it's still using a ruler and rotary cutter. And so this is my first experience kind of improv piecing things together. And you can see I didn't quite get my lines together, but you know, from a distance it looks fine, which is always the key to quilting, I think. You can also see with this free motion, since this, while this was the second block I made in the quilt, as far as piecing went, it was a much later block I made when it came to the quilting, the actual free motion quilting. And so I'm starting to get a little braver with my free motion quilting, and I had a lot of fun. I still use this free motion motif a lot with the super kind of psychedelic wavy lines. And then for the borders, I did kind of this Greek-esque square block around the entire border. So that was super fun. And then I just left the actual pound sign unquilted, which is something I still tend to do. I like to leave portions of my quilt unquilted so that it is visually, gives some little visual dynamism. So the next month of blocks that we made were the Balkan Puzzle block, and then right next to it here we have the chunky chevron. And the techniques I learned here were half square triangles. This was the first time I've ever made half square triangles. And, you know, they went together pretty quickly. And so then once you make your half square triangles in the different fabrics, you just piece them together to create this Balkan Puzzle pattern for this particular block. And then again, looking at the quilting, I just did pretty basic straight line quilting using the seams as my guidelines as far as going from one corner to the next. And I don't use any rulers with my free motion quilting, and so this was all freehand. But when they're close together like this, I'm able to use the edge of my presser foot, my free motion quilting presser foot, open toe foot, to guide me along each line. So they end up being pretty straight. And then I did just some basic straight lines, chevron type shapes in these larger areas here. And it was fun. What was fun learning with the free motion quilting is learning how to work within the alternate shapes that are created by these blocks. And so visually, you have these parallelograms here, but I decided to quilt in these larger areas, making this an entire shape here, rather than just sticking to the parallelogram. And so that was a fun thing to start trying out when I was learning free motion quilting. And then we move over here to the chunky chevron. Again, these are all just half square triangles, as well as some full squares. And then you just piece them together into your chevron shape. And this, you know, took some time for me to figure out how to line up everything correctly. And you see I lost my points here at the top and the bottom, but that's okay. It just makes it seem like it's going out of the frame. And what was exciting for me for this block when it came to the free motion quilting is this is my first attempt at feathers. And you know, they turned out okay. I don't really have any complaints. I've done feathers since this, and they've been worse. And I've also, I practiced them a lot more since then, and now my feathers are pretty good. But for my first try, not bad. And then I did some fun little like feathery flower type shapes up here in these blocks. And then I did just super close matchstick quilting in the navy blue stripes, which takes time, but it's really easy. Again, when you're able to use the edge of your open toe or whatever free motion quilting foot you're using as a guide. And so for our next month of blocks, we started with a string block. And so this uses a foundation. It's not foundation paper piecing, but you're using a fabric foundation to then use as a guide as you continue to add on your strips. And this is very scrappy block, which I soon became enamored with scrappy quilts. And I love just like as scrappy as it can get. And it's a little, string piecing is a little slow going in my opinion, and you end up using more fabric because you have that foundation fabric. So it's a little thicker, which depending on how heavy you want your quilt to be, that can be a good thing. So it's not a technique that I've really ever used again, but it was very helpful as far as using some guidelines as a foundation to create a really nice looking block. And everything lines up really well. And so that was exciting. I think this was the first block of the series where everything kind of lined up perfectly without me having to work too hard at it. So that made me excited that I was actually improving on my skills since, practice makes perfect. And then for the free motion quilting, I just did some zigzag stippling here in the center, and then just some straight lines radiating out from the corners. So nothing too extravagant, but the zigzag stippling is something I still use now. I like that look, and it takes some time, but I think it has a really cool texture to it. And then super close matchstick quilting around this border, and then leaving this middle strip blank. And I went ahead and I kind of did this optical illusion here of creating having this diamond extend out into the border, even though the pattern doesn't actually work that way in the block, and it's not meant to. This is not a point that I lost. This is just the way the block works. But I liked the idea, since this was navy blue and the border was navy blue, I just went ahead and stitched a continuation of the point. So it looks like this navy diamond goes out into the border, which was my first time playing with negative space with the free motion quilting, which was fun. Then we move over on that same month, using a similar technique. We do the broken spider web block, which again, you use a foundation fabric and then you piece the strips. And this was a little more complicated as far as the angles go. You have to do some pretty accurate measuring, but as far as the strips go, they don't have to line up. And so that part was pretty easy and not terribly stressful. And then for the free motion quilting, I just did some big loop-de flowery type patterns here in the corners, and then I just kind of followed the angles of the star in the middle. So nothing too fancy, but it's another fun scrappy block. And then for our next month, we learned how to do English paper piecing. This was the first time I'd ever done English paper piecing, and it wasn't for me. I've never done English paper piecing since then, but I know it's such a huge phenomenon right now in the quilting world, and has been for however long it has been. And so I'm just glad that I understand what people are talking about. This is a very simple paper piecing block, because you only paper piece these 2 rows of hexes, and then the rest is negative space. So it's a cool modern take on a paper pieced block, hexi block, and I really liked that aspect of it. And then I went ahead and did some fussy cutting, which I'd never really done before, and I fussy cut, tried to have the faces of my owls there, along with, surprise, a fox fox in the owl house. This is what I call my block, is it's a fox in the owl house block. And so I thought that was cute. And then for the free motion quilting, I went ahead and kept working on this negative space where I stitched more hexes and then did some really dense stippling in between the hexes to make them puff out a little bit. And so it looks like these hexes kind of start to break free a little bit in the rest of the block, even though it's all just quilting and no actual piecing in that area. And then for the second hexi block, Amy Gibson did a sunshine pattern, but I didn't really like that. It was a little too cutesy for me. And so I have this really beautiful print with this elephant, which is kind of difficult to see the way I stitched it. But you can see it's kind of a Ganesh, Indian elephant god image in the fabric. And I thought if I would make that the center hexi, I would then just do kind of a mandala effect of hexes around it. So it's not at all the pattern that Amy Gibson had for her block, but it's still using English paper piecing technique and the hexes. And then I had a lot of fun just kind of going crazy with the free motion quilting. And I think it's a pretty fun looking block. I like how it turned out. The next series of blocks are log cabin based blocks. So this is what Amy Gibson calls a modern log cabin. And she calls it that because if you know a traditional log cabin, it's a little more symmetrical. This is more asymmetrical. The center block is a little off center, and then the stripes around it are of different widths. And unlike a log cabin where you alternate the strip as you go around, we actually created full squares around the center block with our strips. So that gives it a little bit more of a modern sensibility. Again, I did a fussy cut center square with this nice, beautiful flower here. And this was a really easy block. Log cabins are pretty easy, but what I liked about the log cabin that I learned for the first time was just this idea of starting with one shape in the middle of a block and then just working your way around it. And you don't really even have to measure or anything. You just sew and then cut, sew, cut, sew, cut all the way around and keep going and keep going. And I use that all the time in a lot of my improv piecing, which is fun. And then for the free motion quilting, I went pretty crazy with my dense free motion quilting, and I just did these like flower petal, I think they kind of look like geranium flowers in the middle, which I totally stole from Angela Walters. And then in the middle square, I just outlined that center flower and had radiating outlines around it. So then that was the first block of the log cabin, and then we move up here to the wonky 5-sided log cabin, which uses the log cabin technique, but I don't think you could call this a typical log cabin block at all, which is fine with me, because again, it's super scrappy, which I love. So you basically cut out a center shape, and in the pattern, she has you cut out a 5-sided shape, but no actual measurements or dimensions. You just kind of cut a 5-sided shape, whatever size it turns out. And then you just start taking the scraps that you've been developing over the months while you've been working on this quilt and start sewing them around this shape in the same direction all the way around. And you come up with this really fun wonky log cabin, which I love this block. And again, this block really showed me how dynamic a block can be when you just start with a single shape in the center and work your way around without too much planning. And it turns out really fun. And then for the free motion quilting, all I did was I just did a spiral all the way through the whole block, starting again, because this was wonky, I didn't want to start it in my center block. So I started it down here, and then I just spiraled all the way around. And then the next set of blocks we made were nothing, as far as techniques go, they weren't anything terribly new from what we'd already done. some larger half square triangles. This is the Greek cross block, and so it involved some blocks, some squares where you split up the squares into two different sized rectangles. You have the large square in the center, and then these half square triangles, you piece them together and you get this beautiful block where there's this Greek cross in the middle and then these nice cornerstones here. Not really cornerstones, but these corner blocks. I think this is a beautiful block. A whole quilt made out of this block would be gorgeous. And I particularly like this block because I actually really love the combination of colors and prints in this block. And then for the free motion quilting, I just did some swirls in the middle, which you can't really see here because of the print. And then I used a white thread, which matches the print pretty well. And then I did some outlining of the cross. And with the outlining, I just did a large, like a more space here, and then a thin border, and then a little more space, and then a thin border, which I think is a nice modern look to the quilting. I left the rest of the negative space blank. And then for the corners, I just outlined the vines and flowers that were in the print, which if you're free motion quilting for the first time, that is a really easy way to get some good free motion quilting practice in, is to take a print that has a nice big floral or vine type pattern on it, and then just outline those images. And so you have guides, natural guides in the fabric for you to go by, and you get really comfortable with the free motion quilting technique. So then the second block in that series is this large octagon block. And again, this was a really easy block to put together. It's just 4 half square triangles and then 5 regular squares. So the cutting and the piecing were super easy. And again, I'm getting better, as you can see, hopefully, with lining things up. Everything was lined up, which are, you know, these techniques that Amy Gibson was teaching during the tutorial, how to nest your seams and do these techniques to help you make sure everything lines up. And then the free motion quilting is just some nice floral leafy designs in the corners. And then I actually free motion quilted. This was when I was starting to get really comfortable with my free motion quilting. And so I quilted this rose in the center, completely freestyle, which roses are things I used to draw all the time when I was in high school. So I was like, all right, time to get that skill going again. And then I just outlined it and outlined it. So it has this nice, beautiful petal effect throughout the square. And then because there's this rose in the middle, for the yellow part of the octagon, I just did leaves, which you can't really see because the thread blends really well. But you just have these leaves in the octagon. And so I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased with how that rose turned out. And that's when I really started realizing, all right, I'm getting pretty comfortable with this free motion quilting. And I started realizing how much I love free motion quilting. Now, all you quilting enthusiasts out there will recognize this traditional Dresden plate. I had never done a Dresden plate before, and this was fun. But again, I am not into applique, and so this is another form of applique. And so I've never really done a Dresden since then. But I did have a lot of fun putting this together. I really like the scrappy look of just putting a bunch of prints. And by the time we were getting to these Dresden plates, we had lots of scraps left over. So I was able to just go ahead and dig through my scraps and just have fun putting stuff together and looking at the colors and how they lined up. And that was a nice part of the process. And then, because this was actually the last block that I free motion quilted, I kind of just went all out on my free motion quilting, and I did this little, not really a paisley, but this pattern here in each of the Dresdens. And then I did a nice paisley here in the middle, and then these swirls all along the outside of the Dresden. And it looks good on the front, but it actually looks pretty amazing on the back. And again, this was my last free motion quilting that I did for this quilt, this block. And this is when I really was like, okay, this is how I'm going to quilt all of my quilts from now on. No more walking foot quilting, only free motion quilting. I just found it so freeing, and I just love how it turns out. So then that's the traditional Dresden, and then, whoosh, sorry, hope you're not getting motion sickness. Here we come to this modern Dresden Wheel pattern block, which I love this. Again, I've never done it since because it involves applique. It's not my thing, but I do love the look of this. And it's using the same Dresden technique, but then I can't remember exactly what you do, but you basically like fold under the points to create this really modern looking kind of a sunburst effect. Now this block was the first block I free motion quilted for the quilt. And I wanted to do pebbles because I love pebbles. And of course, by the time I was done with this block doing all these pebbles, which turned out great, but I was like, I don't know if I'll ever do pebbles again. Now, of course, I have done pebbles since then, but pebbles, as great as they look, they take forever. So they're things I use kind of sparingly, and when I'm really feeling patient. But because of the kind of bubbles here in this print, I thought the pebbles in the navy would be a nice effect. And I think it turned out really fun. Okay, so we moved to our next set of blocks, which are star blocks. And so the first one was the Ohio star. And since I am from Ohio, this has now become my favorite traditional quilt block ever. And I do love it. I think it's a really simple, but so geometric and beautifully designed block. I love it when people use Ohio stars in their quilts. Again, I did a fussy cut middle square with this nice big flower in the center. And then quarter square triangles. And so, again, technique-wise, I didn't really learn too much new, and I had yet to perfect my points at this time. I have since learned some techniques to make sure that I keep my points with my star blocks. But I definitely lost most of my points in the star block. And then for the free motion quilting, I just outlined this flower, which was really simple. And then I just followed the patterns of each of these blocks. And then I left these middle navies blank. So that was a really basic free motion quilting technique that I think lends itself well to this geometric shape of this Ohio star. And that kind of free motion quilting goes pretty quickly. So if you don't have a lot of time, just outlining shapes and regularly spacing the quilting goes relatively quickly. And so then our next star block was this double star block. And this involved a lot more cutting and piecing, as you can see. So while I wasn't learning too many new techniques, although I did learn how to make flying geese. This is the first block we used with flying geese. So the flying geese was a new technique, but otherwise it was just half square triangles and regular squares. But they were smaller and just a lot more to them. So it was my first time really seeing how much work goes into cutting and piecing these blocks that people are using in their quilts that are always so beautiful. And it gives me a whole new level of respect for everyone. And again, I stole some Angela Walters motifs with this feathered free motion quilting motif, and then some radiating lines. Now our next set of blocks utilized the Drunkard's Path template, and so that means curved piecing. Now, believe it or not, many, many years ago, when I first thought maybe I'd want to learn how to quilt, I bought this book, Quilts, 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 and the first and only pattern that I did from that book was the Drunkard's Path. And so I actually, the very first time I ever tried to sew a quilting pattern was a drunkard's path with curved piecing. And so when I got to these blocks, I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm so scared of curved piecing. But I was like, oh, I've done this before. It wasn't that bad. So, so this was easier for me than I think it would be for most beginners. But again, Amy Gibson's really good in her tutorials with walking you through different techniques to get through the curved piecing relatively easily. And then for this particular block, we took the drunkard's path and we just lined it up so that they were these chains, which I think is a lovely, almost looks like, I like to think of them as like garden paths. And then I just, for the free motion quilting, I just really did simple lines that followed the curves on either side of the curved paths. So it was really easy, and so that went really fast, but yet I think it's a really nice look. So your free motion quilting does not have to be complicated, and it can still be beautiful. Then we moved down here to Cleopatra's Puzzle, which again, it's the same drunkard's path template. And we just placed them in a different position to create this Cleopatra's Puzzle pattern, which was very cool. And again, since this was the second to last block that I was free motion quilting, I probably went a little crazy. I was getting much more confident, so I have these fan matchstick quilting lines here and these different lines, curved lines. And then the border is pretty complicated, but overall, I think it gives a really cool Art Deco effect to the whole block, which I feel like the block itself has a very Art Deco quality to it, which I dig. I think that's pretty cool. And now we come to the final two blocks of this block of the month quilt. And so this was a foundation paper piecing block series. So we have this friendship circle pattern, and this was my first time foundation paper piecing, and I actually love foundation paper piecing. I don't do it as often as I would like, because I would actually like to learn how to design my own foundation patterns, but I don't know how to do it, and I have yet to find a good tutorial on it. I need to find a class. I need to go to like a workshop or something, but that will be sometime in the future. So anyway, this block, what I really love about foundation paper piecing is as long as you're following the pattern, it all comes together pretty great. And so you get these really cool designs that look super complicated, but they actually aren't that hard. Now, it takes a lot of prep and it takes time. But once you piece it together, it comes together so beautifully. And then I just did these swirls throughout, and I don't love how this turned out as far as the free motion quilting goes. I think I should have done something different with the thread color. But this was only the fourth block that I free motion quilted in this quilt, and so I was still getting comfortable and learning. And I still am. We're always still learning, of course. And then the last and final block that I made for this quilt is this Circle of Geese block. Let me move this out. And I love this block. This is my favorite block pattern that I've ever followed. Again, foundation paper piecing. And look at how beautifully lined up that circle of flying geese is. And again, it was super easy as long as you just followed the pattern. So I love it. I love how it turned out. I've made this another time for another quilt, which I'll show later on in another trunk show video. And then for the free motion quilting, I just kind of, again, followed the outlines of the triangles themselves, and which emphasizes the starburst pattern in the middle, which I love. And yeah, that's that. And so that is the Amy Gibson block of the month quilt. You know, once you make all the blocks, you put them in whatever order you want. I decided I wanted the the 4 kind of circular blocks in the corners, and then I just made adjustments for the rest of the blocks depending on colors and patterns and all that kind of stuff. And then let me show you the back. So because I was doing a quilt as you go technique for each of my blocks when I was free motion quilting them, you end up with these grids that are really visible in the back because I used contrasting fabrics. And because I knew they would end up being a grid, I decided to do alternating fabric for the backs of each block once I had determined the layout of my blocks. And I found this super fun Scandinavian style print with the deer and the fox and stuff. I love it. I love that print so much. And then just a nice basic wood grain, neutral wood grain for the alternating blocks. And I think it's a pretty cool pattern on the back of the quilt. And then you can see here, these are not sewn into the quilt. These are my temporary quilt hangers that I use for quilts that I don't have a hanging sleeve for, because I don't plan on ever actually hanging this quilt. And so that's the back. So that's my second quilt that I've ever made. It's not something I'll ever display, but I'm always going to hold on to it because I learned so much from it, and I still have the tutorial, and I'm still refer back to it every once in a while when there's a particular technique that I want to remind myself about. And I really think it's a great way to learn some techniques. So if you can find a basic sampler quilt that goes through some basic techniques when you're just learning to quilt, I highly suggest doing that. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and come back for the next one. I'll have my third quilt on display. See you then.